Neon lights bled crimson and electric blue through the relentless sheets of rain cascading over Hollywood Boulevard. The glow fractured into oily puddles that reeked of wet asphalt, ozone, and the faint acrid tang of stale piss. Distant sirens keened like the city's ghosts crying for one more breath of smog-choked air before drowning in the gutters. Jack Harlan slouched behind the wheel of his battered, unmarked Crown Vic. The interior smelled of damp leather, cheap tobacco, and ancient regrets. Cigarette smoke twisted in lazy gray spirals against the fogged windshield, dancing to the rhythmic, mechanical thumping of the wipers. He twisted the cap off his thermos with a practiced flick of his thumb, pouring black coffee laced with enough bourbon to numb a toothache into a stained styrofoam cup. It was hot enough to scald and bitter enough to bite back. "LA never sleeps," Jack muttered to the empty passenger seat, his voice a gravelly scrape honed by too many nights spent staring into the abyss. "It just drowns its sins in the rain and hopes the tide doesn't bring them back to shore." His eyes were shattered glass, set in a face carved from bad decisions and worse consequences. Insomnia had hollowed them out years ago, etching deep, dark trenches beneath his lids. But it was the guilt that kept them open, the heavy, suffocating weight of his partner's death 5 years back. The memory was a predator, always lurking in the rearview mirror. It hit him now, without warning. The smell of a fog-choked warehouse near the docks, the sudden, deafening crack of gunfire, and Mike crumpling into the muck. Jack had frozen. For one heartbeat that felt like an eternity, his finger had turned to lead on the trigger of his Glock. He had been too late to fire, too late to drag him clear. The muzzle flash of that final shot still echoed in the private theater of his skull every time he closed his eyes. The police radio crackled to life, the static cutting through the silence like a jagged blade. "All units, possible code 187 at the Vincent Thomas pier. Ritualistic elements reported. Throat slit, ear to ear. Victim is a male, mid-30s. Dispatch notes a silver locket found in the victim's hand, engraved with the word brother. All available units respond." Jack's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. The styrofoam cup crinkled in his scarred hand, hot coffee splashing over his knuckles. He didn't feel the burn. The silver locket, the engraving, it was a mirror image of the piece of jewelry found clutched in Mike's stiff, cold fingers 5 years ago on that warehouse floor. A cheap trinket from their first successful bust together, a symbol of a bond that was supposed to be unbreakable. "Not again," Jack growled, his voice dropping an octave into a predatory snarl. He slammed the thermos into the dashboard and threw the car into gear. The engine roared to life, a mechanical beast screaming for blood. Tires hydroplaned across the slick pavement as he floored it, the Crown Vic fishtailing before gripping the road and hurtling into the heart of the storm. Rain hammered the roof like 1,000 accusatory fists, and thunder rumbled from the black sky like the laughter of a god who had long ago stopped caring about justice. The derelict pier jutted into the harbor like a broken, gangrenous finger. Under the buzzing sodium lamps that cast a jaundiced, sickly yellow glow over the scene, CSI techs in yellow ponchos moved like vultures over a fresh kill. Jack parked his car crookedly, barely avoiding a stack of rotting shipping crates, and stepped out into the deluge. The wind tried to tear the trench coat from his shoulders, carrying the stench of salt, rotting fish guts, and the unmistakable sharp copper tang of fresh blood. The victim was splayed out on the weathered planks, his expensive Italian suit soaked through and clinging to his frame. He looked like a mid-level accountant who had wandered into the wrong neighborhood, or perhaps the right neighborhood for the wrong reasons. His eyes were wide, fixed in a permanent rictus of terror, staring up at the rain as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. His throat was a gaping crimson smile. But it was the chest that made Jack's stomach turn a slow, agonizing circle. A perfect Y incision had been flayed open with the precision of a master surgeon. The ribs had been cracked back like a wishbone to expose the heart, which had been pierced clean through by a slim, elegant stiletto that still glinted wetly under the buzzing lamps. This wasn't a murder.
It was an installation, a mockery of an autopsy. Jack lit another cigarette, shielding the flame from the wind with a trembling hand, and knelt beside the lead tech. The rain needled his neck like ice picks. "Talk to me," Jack rasped. "Professional work, detective," the tech replied without looking up, his voice muffled by a surgical mask. The cut on the throat was one clean motion, no hesitation marks. But the chest, that was done while he was still alive. He watched them do it. And the locket, it was tucked into his palm as if he were being asked to hold a secret. Jack's gaze shifted to the victim's sodden wallet lying a few feet away. He reached out and flipped it open with a slim, gloved finger. Water slooshed off the leather as a slim silver USB drive tumbled out. It was etched with a corporate logo Jack half recognized from the old files, the ones that had been buried after Mike's funeral. Before the tech could notice, Jack palmed the drive and slid it into his pocket. Suddenly, a movement caught his eye. High above on the bridge's rusted girders, a shadow flitted through the rain. It was a silhouette Jack would know in a crowded room or a pitch-black alley. Broad shoulders, a certain tilt of the head, a ghost from a life he had tried to burn down. Jack's hand flew to his holster, thumb flicking the safety off his Glock. He swept the darkness with the barrel, his heart slamming against his ribs like a trapped animal. The wind howled through the steel struts, a mournful sound that seemed to carry a name. "Elias?" Jack whispered, the name tasting like ash. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a sharp vibration that cut through the adrenaline. He pulled it out, the screen blurring under fat drops of water. An anonymous text glowed on the display. "You are next, brother."
The drive back to Echo Park felt like navigating a river of liquid shadows. Every pair of headlights in the rearview mirror was a threat, every flicker of a street lamp a potential muzzle flash. Jack gripped the steering wheel so hard the cheap leather groaned in protest. His knuckles were white, bloodless, mirroring the ghostly pallor of the city beneath the storm. He reached his apartment building, a sagging concrete hive that seemed to be held together only by layers of peeling paint and the shared misery of its tenants. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his heavy boots thudding against the water-stained carpet, leaving a trail of damp footprints that looked like an invitation to a stalker. Inside, the apartment was a tomb. The air was thick with the smell of moldy takeout cartons, stale tobacco, and the ozone of an ancient laptop that hummed like a dying insect on his desk. Jack didn't turn on the lights. He preferred the blue, ghostly flicker of the TV static and the rhythmic flash of a nearby neon sign that cast long, skeletal shadows across his stacks of yellowed case files. He sat down, his trench coat heavy and sodden, and slotted the silver USB drive into the port. The computer groaned, its fan whirring into a frantic, high-pitched scream as it struggled to digest the encrypted data. Files began to spill across the screen like blood from an open wound. Spreadsheets bleeding red ink, wire transfers to offshore ghost accounts, and scrambled lists of syndicate names that made Jack's skin crawl. These weren't just numbers. They were a roadmap, a thread pulled straight from the warehouse raid 5 years ago, weaving through the accountant on the pier and ending squarely at Jack's own throat. Names jumped out at him, coded aliases he remembered from Mike's private notes. Mike hadn't been investigating these people. He had been working for them. The realization was a slow-acting poison, burning through Jack's veins, turning his memories of his partner into ash. "You kept us in the dark, Mike," Jack whispered to the empty room, his eyes fixed on a wire transfer dated 2 days before the raid. "Or maybe you just kept me there." Paranoia slithered in, cold and oily. He felt the sudden irrational urge to check the locks, to sweep the room for bugs, to disappear into the rain and never come back. Instead, he snatched his phone and dialed the only number etched into his memory that didn't belong to a dead man or a dirty cop. Lena Voss answered on the second ring. In the background, a wall of industrial synths throbbed with a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat. "Jackie boy," she purred, her voice a mix of smoke and silk.
Digging graves again? Or did you finally decide to take me up on that drink? I need a trace, Lena, now. Deep web bounce, encrypted text. The sender called me brother and knew exactly where I was standing 10 minutes ago. Jack's voice was a jagged edge, frayed by the bourbon and the terror he refused to acknowledge. Kinky, Lena replied, though her tone sharpened instantly into professional focus. Give me 5 minutes to bypass the filters, but you're going to owe me more than a drink this time, detective. I want the good stuff, top shelf, no chaser. The line went dead. Jack sat in the dark, the only sound the frantic ticking of the laptop's clock. Outside, the rain hammered the single window like 1,000 desperate fingers demanding entry. Then, the screen flickered. A new window popped up, bypassing his security. It was a map of Skid Row, a pulsing red dot marking an abandoned server farm 3 miles away. Signal's a ghost, Jack. Lena's voice came through the laptop speakers, distorted by her own scrambling software. But that's your origin point. It's an old government facility, decommissioned 10 years ago, perfect for a psycho with a server rig and a grudge. But be careful. Whoever sent that text didn't just find you. They're watching your precinct's internal comms. The call is coming from inside the house, Jackie. The lights in the apartment flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the room into absolute blackness. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. Jack froze, his hand moving slowly toward the Glock on the desk. He heard it then, the faint metallic scrape of a boot on the fire escape outside. Someone had cut the power. Someone was hunting him in his own home. Not tonight, he hissed, lunging for the window.
Jack burst into the rain-soaked alleys of Skid Row like a man shot from a cannon. The air here was thicker, choked with the acrid smoke of barrel fires and the scent of wet despair. Homeless encampments huddled under blue tarps that flapped in the wind like the wings of dying birds. He moved through the labyrinth, his pulse thundering in his ears, every shadow a potential assassin. He had spotted the figure 3 blocks back, a hooded silhouette that moved with a terrifying, familiar grace. It was the same broad-shouldered ghost from the bridge, cutting through the deluge with effortless precision. He vaulted a rusted chain-link fence, the metal rattling in protest. His coat snagged on a jagged cardboard, slick as black ice, but he pushed off, his Glock drawn low and steady. The pursuer mirrored his every move, leaping over trash bins and navigating the debris with a baleotic fluidity that made Jack's stomach churn. Not my brother. It can't be, he told himself, though the lie felt thin and fragile. A knife glinted under a flickering street lamp, a silver whisper in the downpour. Jack squeezed off a warning shot. The crack echoed through the narrow chute of the alley, the bullet pinging off a dumpster in a shower of sparks. The figure didn't flinch. Instead, they vaulted up a fire escape, the iron rungs groaning under the weight. Jack pursued, his breath coming in ragged, painful saws. The world narrowed to the sound of his own heartbeat and the splash of his boots in the oily puddles. He cornered the figure in a dead-end lot filled with the carcasses of stripped cars and piles of rotting tires. "LAPD, down on the ground, now!" Jack screamed, his voice raw and desperate. The figure stopped. They turned slowly, the hood falling back just enough to catch the jaundiced light of a distant sodium lamp. The face was obscured by shadow and rain, but the build was unmistakable. It was like looking into a distorted mirror. The figure reached out, not with a weapon, but with a gesture, a slow, deliberate beckoning. Then, as if fueled by the lightning that cracked the sky, the figure melted into the gloom, slipping through a gap in the fence like silk through fingers. Jack lunged, his hand closing on nothing but cold, wet air, but his fingers snagged on something small and slick. A surgical glove had tumbled free in the struggle, a monogrammed EK etched faintly into the latex. Elias Kane. His phone buzzed again, the vibration feeling like an electric shock against his thigh. It was Lena. "Trace complete, Harlan. Your ghost, he's not just in the system, he's inside your precinct right now.
He's using a terminal registered to the captain's office. Jack, get your ass back to Central. This isn't just a hit, it's an execution. The bullpen at LAPD Central was a fluorescent purgatory. The hum of the overhead tubes mixed with the rhythmic gurgle of the coffee percolator and the distant muffled patter of rain against the reinforced skylights. The air was thick with the scent of stale donuts, toner dust, and the lingering, bitter smell of cheap cigars. Jack burst through the heavy double doors, a drowned beast dripping wrath across the linoleum. Cops looked up from their desks, their murmurs dying as he passed. His reputation for violence and instability preceded him like a foul odor. Captain Ruiz sat in his glass-walled office, a stoic veteran with a cigar clamped eternally between his jowls. He looked up as Jack slammed the door so hard the glass rattled in its frame. "Jack, you look like drowned shit," Ruiz said, his voice a calm, low rumble. "What's the fire this time?" "The fire is under your seat, Captain," Jack growled, leaning over the desk until he was inches from the older man's face. "Who carved the accountant on the pier? And don't give me the usual departmental runaround. I found the USB. I know about the offshore accounts. I know about Mike." Ruiz didn't blink. He just let a slow plume of smoke curl toward the ceiling. "You're chasing ghosts, Jack. Mike was a hero. The accountant was a casualty of the streets. You're tired. Go home." "I'm not going anywhere," Jack said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a death sentence. He turned and stormed into the interrogation room where they were holding a low-level fixer yanked from the USB files. The man was sweating rivers under the hot lamp, his eyes darting like trapped rats in a face pocked with acne scars. Jack didn't wait for the protocol. He slammed the fixer against the wall, his hand tightening around the man's throat. "Talk. The accountant, the yai cut, the stiletto. Who gave the order?" The fixer licked his cracked lips, the chains of his handcuffs rattling against the metal table. I don't know names." Jack leaned in closer, his reflection in the one-way glass looking like a monster he no longer recognized. "Lie to me again, and I'll etch that same yai cut on you myself. I'll do it slow. I'll make you watch." The door cracked open. Lena Voss slipped in, her electric pink hair a neon streak against the drab gray of the precinct. She palmed Jack a burner phone, its screen glowing with a fresh batch of wire transfers. $2 million funneled into a private military account named Shadow Ops. The timestamp synced perfectly with the warehouse raid 5 years ago. "Brought some toys," she whispered, her flirtatious grin masking the lethal intent in her eyes. "But we're out of time, Jack. Look outside." The fixer finally broke, his voice a terrified wheeze. "It's Kane, Elias Kane. He's not just a hitman, he's the captain's insurance policy, and he's here to collect." At that moment, the sirens outside began to wail, but they weren't calling for help, they were a warning. Glass exploded inward as a drive-by peppered the bullpen with high-caliber rounds. Bullets whizzed like angry hornets, chewing the wooden desks into splinters. Chaos erupted, cops diving for cover, screams drumming in the roar of automatic fire. Jack hit the floor, the shards of glass crunching under his elbows as rain and cordite gusted through the shattered windows. He rolled prone, his Glock barking double taps into the gloom. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore, he was fighting for the truth, and the truth was a bullet aimed straight for his heart.
The world dissolved into a cacophony of shattering glass and rhythmic thunder. The air inside the precinct, once stagnant and heavy with the smell of old paper, was now replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of cordite and the freezing intrusion of the storm. Jack felt the vibration of the heavy caliber rounds slamming into the masonry above his head, sending showers of plaster dust down like gray snow. He pressed his face against the cold linoleum floor, smelling the floor wax and the copper of his own blood where a stray shard of glass had grazed his cheek. Next to him, Lena was a shadow of focused energy, her fingers dancing across the screen of her tablet, even as she curled into a ball to minimize her profile. "They're not trying to arrest us, Jack," she screamed over the roar of a submachine gun chewing through a nearby row of filing cabinets. This is a scorched earth policy. Ruiz is wiping the slate clean." Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. He crawled toward a fallen officer, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He snatched a discarded Remington shotgun from the limp grip of a uniform whose eyes were already staring into the void. The weight of the weapon was a grim comfort. He pumped the slide, a heavy, mechanical clack-clack that sounded like a death sentence. Two men in black tactical gear and gas masks burst through the rear service entrance. They moved with the silent, predatory efficiency of professionals, not street thugs. These were the shadow ops Elias had mentioned. Jack didn't hesitate. He rose just enough to clear the edge of a mahogany desk and pulled the trigger. The shotgun kicked like a mule, the recoil bruising his shoulder, but the blast caught the lead attacker square in the chest, hurling him backward into the rain-slicked hallway. The second attacker dived behind a heavy water cooler, returning fire with short, disciplined bursts that stitched a line of holes across the drywall inches from Jack's ear. "Lena, the back exit now!" Jack roared, grabbing her by the collar of her leather jacket and dragging her toward the heavy steel doors of the evidence locker. A flashbang grenade skittered across the floor, glowing with a malevolent white-hot intensity before detonating. The world turned into a silent, blinding void. Jack's ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the storm. He felt himself stumbling, his equilibrium shattered, his lungs burning from the acrid smoke. He felt a hand on his arm, strong, sure, and terrifyingly familiar. For a second, through the white haze, he saw a face. It wasn't Ruiz. It was a mirror. A hooded figure stood over him, the Glock aimed at his chest. But the shot never came. The figure simply kicked Jack's weapon away and vanished into the smoke, just as the precinct's emergency sprinklers hissed to life. Cold water drenched the room, mixing with the blood and the soot, turning the floor into a black, slippery mire. Jack blinked away the stinging water, his vision slowly returning. The attackers were gone, leaving only the dead and the dying in the fluorescent purgatory. He looked down and saw a glint in the water. A silver badge, scratched and dented, lay at his feet. He picked it up. Mike's number. But this wasn't Mike's old badge. It was a new one issued to a private security firm. The betrayal was complete. His partner hadn't just died a corrupt cop, he had lived to become the architect of Jack's nightmare.
They holed up in Lena's van, a hulking black beast parked in a foggy industrial yard behind a derelict cannery. The interior was a claustrophobic nest of humming servers, glowing monitors, and the faint, sweet scent of her vanilla vape smoke. Outside, the rain had intensified, a relentless deluge that threatened to wash the city into the Pacific. Jack sat in the back, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette, the flare of the match illuminating the hollows of his face. He looked like a ghost haunting his own life. "Look at this, Jack," Lena said, her voice dropping the flirtatious edge. She pointed to a decrypted log on her main screen. The wire transfers didn't start with Ruiz. They started with you, 5 years ago, 2 weeks before the warehouse raid. Jack felt a cold stone drop into his stomach. That's impossible. I was the one who pushed for the bust. I was the one who wanted Kane behind bars. "The records don't lie, Jackie boy," she said, her eyes flickering with a mix of pity and fear. "There's a digital signature, your biometric encryption. You didn't just know about the bribe. You were the one who authorized the payout to Elias. You were the courier, Jack. You and Mike were a team, all right? A team of cleaners." Jack leaned back, the smoke from his cigarette stinging his eyes. The memories began to shift, the edges of the warehouse raid blurring and reforming. He remembered the smell of the fog, the weight of the Glock, but now he remembered something else. He remembered Elias standing over Mike, and he remembered himself nodding. He remembered the silver locket not as a gift from a partner, but as a payment for a job done. "My mind, it's fractured, Lena. I don't remember being that man," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. Traumatic amnesia is a hell of a drug, especially mixed with the guilt of killing your best friend to cover your tracks, Lena said, her fingers never stopping their frantic dance across the keyboard. But Elias didn't forget. He's been waiting for you to wake up. He didn't send that text to scare you. He sent it to remind you who you really are. A sudden thud rocked the van. Jack grabbed his weapon, his eyes darting to the rear-view monitor. A black SUV had rammed them, its headlights lancing through the fog like the eyes of a deep-sea predator. The assault began before Jack could draw breath. The side door was ripped open with a scream of tearing metal. Jack kicked outward, his heavy boot catching an assailant in the chest, sending him sprawling into the muck. He tumbled out of the van, the freezing rain instantly soaking through his shirt. He stayed low, firing prone as bullets sparked off the van's armored grille. Lena was screaming something about a drone, but her voice was drowned out by the roar of the SUV's engine as it surged forward again. He grappled with a masked man in the muck, the two of them rolling in a frantic, desperate struggle for control. Jack felt a knee drive into his gut, knocking the wind from his lungs, but he responded with a brutal elbow to the man's throat. He felt the cartilage crunch, a sickeningly soft sound that made his stomach turn. He surged to his feet, wiping the mud from his eyes, just in time to see the SUV peel away into the fog. He looks back at the van. Lena was standing in the doorway, her gun half raised, her eyes wide with a terrifying doubt. She wasn't looking at the escaping SUV, she was looking at him. "Who are you, Jack?" Jack asked, the barrel of her weapon steady. "Are you the cop who wants justice, or are you the ghost who started all this?" Jack stood in the rain, the water sluicing off his face like tears. He didn't have an answer. The locket in his pocket felt like it weighed 100 pounds. He turned away from her, walking into the darkness of the industrial yard toward the silhouette of the cannery. He knew Elias was inside. He knew the ending was already written. He just had to decide which version of himself would be the one to die.
The abandoned cannery loomed out of the fog like a monolithic tombstone, its rusted corrugated walls groaning under the weight of the Pacific wind. But it wasn't silent. From deep within its concrete bowels, a rhythmic, bone-deep throb shook the earth, a dark industrial bass line that sounded like the heartbeat of a dying machine. This was the Shadow Ops Sanctuary, a place where the city's underground met its executioners. Jack approached the perimeter, his movements fluid and low, a predatory instinct taking over where his shattered morality had left off. The rain was his only ally now, a silver curtain that masked his approach from the sentries pacing the catwalks above. Inside, the transition was jarring. The freezing dampness of the night was replaced by a humid, suffocating heat that smelled of sweat, ozone, and chemical euphoria. Red strobes slashed through the thick, artificial fog, painting the writhing bodies of the ravers in jagged streaks of crimson. It was a sea of fishnets, glow paint, and pupils blown wide with synthetic poison. Jack moved through the crowd like a ghost, his hood up, his hand never leaving the grip of the Glock hidden beneath his coat. The music was a physical assault, a sonic wall that made it impossible to hear his own thoughts. He saw the graffiti on the crumbling pillars. Shadow claims all. The words pulsed in the strobe light, mocking him. He looked down at his own wrist, at the faded tattoo he had gotten at 17, the same 3 words, etched in a moment of blood brotherhood he had spent a decade trying to erase. The itch in his skin was a phantom pain, a reminder that he was never truly a cop. He was just a wolf wearing a badge. He cornered a dealer in a dark alcove behind a stack of rusted fish oil drums. The man was young, his face a canvas of silver piercings and terror. Jack grabbed him by the jaw, slamming his head back against the cold metal. "Where is Kane?" Jack roared, though his voice was barely a whisper against the thundering bass. "He's upstairs, the VIP deck.
The dealer choked out, his eyes darting toward a spiral staircase guarded by two men who looked like they were carved from granite. "He's expecting family, man. He said the brother would come home." Jack didn't thank him. He drove a knee into the dealer's stomach, leaving him to curl into a ball amidst the discarded vials of poison. He turned toward the stairs. There was no more room for subtlety. He drew his weapon, the matte black steel reflecting the red strobes. As he stepped onto the staircase, the first guard reached for a shoulder holster. Jack was faster. He didn't fire. He used the weight of the Glock as a hammer, smashing it into the guard's temple. The man crumbled, sliding down the slippery treads. The second guard lunged, but Jack shoulder-checked him over the rail. The wet crunch of bone on concrete 30 feet below was lost in the drop of the baseline.
The top floor was a different world. The music was muffled here, replaced by the low hiss of steam from leaking pipes and the distant rhythmic dripping of the rain through the hole in the roof. Jack breached the heavy oak doors of the executive office, his weapons swept in a professional arc. But the man waiting for him wasn't Elias. Captain Ruiz sat in a high-backed leather chair, a glass of expensive bourbon in one hand and a thick ledger book in the other. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a tired bureaucrat finishing a long day's work. Behind him, the panoramic window looked out over the rain-swept hills of Los Angeles, the city lights flickering like dying embers. "You were always the best of us, Jack," Ruiz said, his voice steady despite the barrel pointed at his head. "The best because you could lie to yourself better than anyone I've ever met. Mike couldn't do it. He cracked. He started seeing the faces of the people we stepped on. But you just closed your eyes and let your brother do the dirty work." "Shut up," Jack hissed, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You used us. You turned a precinct into a syndicate." "I didn't turn anything," Ruiz laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "This city is a business, Jack, and you were my star employee. Look at the ledger." Ruiz slid the book across the desk. Jack's eyes flickered down to the pages. It was a meticulously kept record of payoffs, bribes, and hits. Every entry was backed by a signature. His own signature. The ink was old, faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It wasn't forged. It was a record of a life he had lived before the warehouse raid. A life he had locked away in a dark corner of his mind after the trauma of seeing Mike fall. "Lena set this up," Jack said, though the words felt hollow. "Lena is a freelancer, kid. She works for the highest bidder, and right now the highest bidder is the man who wants his brother back." Ruiz stood up slowly, reaching for a painting on the wall. He swung it open to reveal a hidden safe. "The memory serum Elias used on you was experimental, Jack. It didn't erase the past, it just buried it under a layer of artificial morality. You wanted to be a hero so badly that you invented a version of yourself that didn't take the money. But the money is still there, in a bank in Zurich, waiting for you to claim it." Jack's head throbbed. Shards of memory began to pierce through the fog. The sound of his own laughter as he counted stacks of $100 bills. The cold weight of the silver locket as he handed it to Elias to mark their first contract. He wasn't the victim of a conspiracy. He was the architect of his own damnation. "Elias is waiting for you in the boiler room, Jack," Ruiz said, his eyes filled with a twisted kind of paternal pride. "He's got the final payout. All you have to do is finish the job. Kill the only person who knows the truth. Kill me." Jack looked at the ledger, then at the captain, then at his own scarred hands. The rain hammered the glass, a relentless, judging sound.
He didn't pull the trigger. Instead, he smashed the butt of his gun into Ruiz's face, a brutal, messy blow that sent the older man sprawling. "I'm not a hero," Jack whispered, stepping over the captain's unconscious body.
The boiler room was a subterranean hell of hissing valves and rusted iron. Thick white steam billowed from the pipes, creating a shifting, opaque world where visibility was less than 3 feet. Jack moved through the mist, his senses heightened to a breaking point. He could smell the sulfur, the hot oil, and the sharp metallic tang of Elias's presence. "Welcome home, Jack." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the damp concrete walls. Elias emerged from the steam like a wraith. He was dressed in tailored black, his surgical gloves gleaming under the dim red emergency lights. The stiletto in his hand was a needle of silver, dancing between his fingers with hypnotic speed. "You left me to rot in that warehouse," Elias said, his voice devoid of anger, filled only with a cold, clinical curiosity. "I spent 5 years in a hole while you played dress-up in a blue uniform. You even convinced yourself you were one of the good guys. It was a beautiful lie, brother. I almost didn't want to break it." "It wasn't a lie," Jack rasped, his Glock steady. "It was a choice. I chose to stop." "You didn't choose anything. You broke. You saw Mike's brains on the pavement and you couldn't handle the fact that you were the one who put him there." Elias lunged, a blur of motion. Jack fired, but the steam distorted his aim. The bullet pinged off a heavy iron pipe, sending a spray of scalding water into the air. Elias was on him in an instant. The stiletto flashed, catching Jack in the shoulder, a hot, searing pain that made his arm go numb. Jack dropped the gun and grappled with his brother, their bodies slamming into a vibrating boiler. They rolled across the oil-stained floor, a primal struggle for survival. Jack felt Elias's thumbs digging into his throat, cutting off his air. He looked into Elias's eyes, his own eyes, and saw the abyss staring back. Elias wasn't just his twin, he was his shadow, the manifestation of every dark impulse Jack had ever acted upon. "We're the same, Jack," Elias hissed, his face inches from his own. "We're the twins of the storm. Protect each other, remember? That was the promise." Jack felt his strength fading. His vision began to tunnel, the red strobes of the factory upstairs blurring into a single bloody haze. He reached out, his hand fumbling in the muck of the floor, until his fingers closed around the silver locket that had fallen from his pocket during the struggle. He didn't use it as a weapon. He held it up, the engraving glinting in the dim light. "Protect each other," Jack choked out. Elias froze. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the clinical killer slipped. The grip on Jack's throat loosened. In that heartbeat of hesitation, Jack drove his forehead into Elias's nose with a sickening crunch. He followed up with a brutal knee to the gut, throwing his brother back into the path of a high-pressure steam vent. A valve blew. A geyser of scalding white vapor erupted, engulfing Elias. The scream that tore from his throat was the most human sound Jack had heard in years. The roof of the cannery was an island of gravel and rusted vents floating in a sea of horizontal rain. The chopper downdraft whipped Jack's blood-soaked trench coat around his legs like the wings of a broken crow. He stumbled toward the ledge, his breath coming in shallow, agonizing gasps that tasted of copper and ozone. His shoulder was a scream of white-hot agony where the stiletto had pierced the muscle, and his vision was beginning to fray at the edges, dissolving into static. "Don't take another step, Jackie boy." A voice cut through the howling wind, sharp and cold as a shard of ice. Lena Voss stood by the communications array, her neon-pink hair plastered to her skull by the storm. She held a heavy taser baton that crackled with blue arcs of electricity, and a compact submachine gun was slung over her shoulder with professional ease. There was no flirtatious purr in her voice now, no mask of the opportunistic hacker. She looked at him with the clinical detachment of a butcher evaluating a piece of meat. "The captain is dead, Lena," Jack rasped, his voice barely audible over the thunder. "The ledger, the accounts, it's over." Ruiz was a dinosaur, Jack. He was just the middleman. The syndicate doesn't care about ledgers. They care about loose ends. And you, Elias, and that old man were the last ones left. The air behind Jack shifted. Elias emerged from the stairwell, his face a mask of blistered skin and raw fury from the steam vent. He looked like a man who had already died but forgotten to lie down. He ignored Lena, his hollow eyes fixed solely on his brother. "The promise, Jack," Elias hissed, the stiletto still gripped in his scarred hand. "You broke the only thing we had." The triple melee erupted in a blur of motion and steel. Lena lunged with the baton, the discharge lighting up the rain in strobes of electric blue. Jack parried the strike with his forearm, the shock numbing his entire side, and countered with a desperate hook that shattered the baton's casing. At the same moment, Elias threw himself at Lena, a primal roar tearing from his throat. The three of them rolled across the wet gravel in a frantic, bloody knot of limbs and blades. Jack felt a sharp sting in his side, Lena's hidden derringer. He gritted his teeth, grabbing his wrist and twisting until he heard the snap of bone. She screamed, but before he could finish it, Elias's blade flashed in the darkness. It wasn't aimed at Jack. It buried itself in Lena's chest, the silver needle finding the gap between her ribs with surgical precision. She slumped back, her eyes wide with shock as the life leaked out of her into the pooling rainwater. Elias turned back to Jack, the two of them kneeling in the muck like broken icons. The rain was turning into a fine mist as the first gray light of the horizon began to bleed over the clouds. "I remembered, Elias," Jack whispered, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the silver locket. "I remembered the warehouse. It wasn't you who killed Mike." The memory finally solidified, cold and unforgiving. 5 years ago, in the fog, Mike had begged Jack to take the money and run. He had told Jack that Elias was a liability, a loose end that needed to be cut. And Jack, fueled by a sudden, terrifying clarity, had raised his own gun and fired. He hadn't frozen. He had executed his partner to protect his brother and the fortune they had built. The amnesia wasn't a side effect of a serum. It was a frantic, desperate act of his own mind to erase the monster he had become. "I know, Jack," Elias said softly, the rage leaving his face, replaced by a devastating weariness. "I've been carrying that secret for you for 5 years, Jack. I stayed in the dark so you could pretend to be in the light." Elias reached out, his fingers brushing the silver locket in Jack's hand. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against his brother's. In that final, fractured embrace, Elias let go of the stiletto. He closed his eyes, his breathing slowing until it was nothing more than a sigh that the wind carried away. Jack sat there for a long time as the sun rose, a pale, sickly disk behind the clouds. He looked into the rearview mirror of an abandoned truck. He didn't see a detective. He didn't see a hero. He saw two faces, identical and inseparable, staring back from the abyss. "Together now," he whispered, his own voice sounding like his brother's. "Forever." He stood up, the locket dangling from his hand, and walked toward the edge of the roof. Below him, the city was waking up, oblivious to the blood shed in its name. He tossed the locket into the void and watched it disappear into the gray fog. Then he turned and walked into the morning, a ghost among the living, with the twins of the storm finally at rest within his soul. Thunder rolled one last time in the distance. Fade to black.